Okay, I'll get started and people can join still as they arrive. Welcome everybody to Bird Identification for Beginners. I'm so happy that you're here with us tonight. Um, just a few housekeeping things, I guess, before we get started and I introduce myself. We have this in a meeting format, so please keep your mic muted throughout the session until the question period at the end, just to eliminate background noise for everybody else. We are recording the session right now, and we will be providing that recording to everybody sometime later this week or early next week, as well as some other resources. So you don't need to worry about jotting down notes the whole time or anything like that. You can feel free to put questions in the chat box as we go along, and we'll have time at the end for people to unmute and ask questions, or we can go through anything that's popped up during the presentation. Catherine Dale is here, as well as Belle, and they will be monitoring the chat as well as helping out with any sort of logistical issues that we have coming up. So I'll start off now by introducing myself. My name is Jenna McDermott, and I'm the Assistant Coordinator for the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. I mentioned Catherine Dale. She is the coordinator for the Atlas, and Belle on the call is our intern for the winter. So a little bit about myself. I lived in Newfoundland for a wonderful 7 years, and I continue to get to visit in the summers for our field seasons, which is really nice. I've always been involved in nature, but I really only got into birds at the end of my undergraduate degree in Ontario. After that, I sort of took every opportunity I could to volunteer with birding, do contract work with birds, and now I am lucky enough to work for Birds Canada. So I, along with many of you, started out as a complete beginner in bird identification, and now that's my full-time job. So it's something that everybody can learn, and hopefully today's presentation will help give you some background that will help you out in that journey. So I do work for an organization called Birds Canada. It's a nonprofit organization whose mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. We do this mostly through a series of citizen science programs all across the country. And each year, over 70,000 volunteers share their energy skills and bird observations with our citizen science programs. And citizen science, for anyone who's unfamiliar with the term, is basically volunteers or regular people like you who are interested in getting involved, interested in birds in this case, and becoming part of a program where you collect data and put that into a cause where we can use to conserve birds. Right now in Newfoundland, we are running 2 different programs. The first one I'll talk about is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. We will be doing a webinar specifically on the Breeding Bird Atlas during this series. It's called Atlasing for Beginners. So if you want to dive deeper into that, definitely sign up for that session. I can't remember the date, but maybe Catherine can put it in the chat for me. And so the purpose of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas is to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the birds that breed on the island of Newfoundland. So it doesn't include Labradors, just the island of Newfoundland. It's a big enough land area, I think, to start with. So we'll tackle that first. And as you can see, the end result is making maps like the one you can see on the right here. So this is a map of where all the blue jays have been found so far since 2020 when this program started in Newfoundland, all across the island. This is a citizen science program, and it's basically held up by the efforts of volunteers. And so anybody is welcome to join us in that program. No matter your skill level, you can have important sightings that can go in there. Even if all you know is a blue jay or a robin and you see them building a nest, that's all important information. So we will have our contact information at the end. You can feel free to reach out about getting involved with that. Our second program that we run in Newfoundland is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey. And this is another citizen science program, and it involves driving along a roadside route for only one night every spring. And basically you get to stop at 10 different stops and listen for owls that are calling back to you. So it's super fun, and not too much time commitment, and quite easy as a beginner sort of activity to get involved in, since there's not too many species to worry about. This is another one that we're always recruiting people for. So if that's something that interests you, there's also going to be a owl presentation as one of the sessions in this series. And I can't remember the date for that either, but Catherine can probably put it in the chat for me. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely reach out. I'll take a quick second here to thank our partners and funders, because without their support, we wouldn't be able to put on sessions like this for free to the public and run our programs like we do. And lastly, before we really begin our content for the day, I would like to acknowledge that the lands that we are running these programs on, that we live and work on, are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people, and as well as the unceded traditional territories. So these people have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. And through the work of our programs, we hope to assist in the stewardship to protect these species that we share the island with. Birds Canada understands that Indigenous voices, knowledge, and ongoing work on the land are critical for wild birds to thrive in sustainable ecosystems. So we support the needs, aspirations, and rights of Indigenous peoples to care for the land. If you're interested in learning more about what Indigenous lands you live or work on, I'd recommend the website down at the bottom there, nativeland.ca, as a really great place to start exploring that. So this is our outline for how tonight's going to go. First of all, we'll go through some essential tools that will help you with birding and identifying birds. We'll go through some bird ID basics, and then we'll go through the major bird families that are found on the island of Newfoundland. We aren't going to get into like specific species very much today. I'm really going to be going more broad strokes just to give you the basics of what you need in order to know even what to look for when you're trying to tell different species apart. So let's start with a very important tool when you're looking at birds, which is binoculars. So of course you can watch birds with just your eyes, but sometimes that can be really frustrating because the bird is far away. It's like hidden halfway by a tree. You can't see it very well. So binoculars are really nice because they're just bringing that bird essentially closer to you. When you're looking at, if you're looking at buying binoculars, they can be somewhat costly. So keep that in mind. And they come in a very large range of price tags. But even ones at the lower end of the price range can still be really helpful. They will come always with two numbers associated with them. So for example, here I have 8 times 42 written down at the bottom, and people pronounce that as 8 by 42. And that basically tells you the magnification, which is the first number, the 8. So it's 8 times magnified. And then 42 is the aperture, which tells you how much light and the field of vision. So 8 by 42 is a pretty good number to look for when you're starting out getting binoculars. That's the number that I have for my binoculars, and most of the people that I work with as well have those. It can be tempting to think that a higher magnification is better, and it will certainly give you a larger view of whatever you're looking at. However, it can be difficult to work with a 10 times magnification just because they're often heavier and bulkier, so it's harder to keep a steady hand. And it's also harder to find the birds because you're more magnified to start with. So it can be hard to, or frustrating to find birds while you're already looking. If you are looking to buy binoculars, I'd recommend asking about warranties and repairs, because it's really nice if you can get sort of lifetime warranties, which comes with several of the brands. Ask other people about the binoculars they own, see if you can try them out, and make sure that they fit the way that your face is laid out. Like for example, my eyes are, I have, I guess, a small face, and my eyes are quite close together. So some binoculars, even when I have them all the way together, I still can't see the image put into one instead of two. So just try out as many as you can, and then get a set of binoculars that works for your eyes and also your budget. If we're talking about actually using binoculars, you can see in this picture, if you take a look at the section near the faces, there's a part called the eye cups, and you can have them either in a downward or an upright position. And you'll do that based on whether or not you're wearing glasses or sunglasses. And that's just to have the distance between your eye and the lens as the proper length so that you can focus properly. So if you have eyeglasses or sunglasses on, you'll want to have the cups as far down as they can go. And if you're not wearing glasses, then they either twist or flip up to be in the upward position. And it's also tempting when you are trying to start using binoculars, if you're not familiar with them, to like put them up to your face and look around for the bird. That is not That's gonna be really frustrating because once it's already magnified, it's really hard to find anything. So what you should do is find out where the bird is with your eyes first and your ears, um, and then keep your eyes on it. And then as you are looking at it still, lift your binoculars up to your eyes. So you're looking at the bird and lift your binoculars up. And that way you don't have to like shuffle around in the magnified tree so much trying to find a bird. It might sound silly or feel silly, but you can also practice in your house with pictures on the wall, your roommates or family, to make sure that you are able to get the object in your field of vision nearly every time. And that'll really limit your frustrations when you're trying to find a bird that's flitting around in the bushes. Practice makes perfect for everything, right? Even binoculars. Okay, we'll move off of binoculars now and go into field guides and reference books. So these are two really important things when you are learning to identify birds, of course, because they're going to have all of the birds that you want to know about in them. They come in different formats. So the first one are paper guides. These are physical books, and they're really nice because you can scan through them, see all of the birds at the same time, flip through them. They don't ever run out of battery. You can drop them and they don't break. All of these reasons are really good to have a paper copy. There are different kinds here. So there's painted field guides, like what I have in the top left. They will have a painting of the bird in a posture and positioning and showing the specific clues that are most useful to identifying them, often with arrows pointing to certain parts of the body and that sort of thing. Oh, wow, I just somehow went far ahead. Okay, sorry. Then there's also photographic field guides, and those, instead of using a painted picture of the bird, they use actual photographs of the bird. And those are really nice because you can see what the bird looks like in real life. It doesn't necessarily pull out specific ID points, though, in the same way that the painted field guide does. So it's just a matter of preference, which one you like more. You can also get regional field guides. So at the top under the painted field guide, it says Sibley's birds. If you could see me, this is that book. It's like quite large. But if you get just the north or the eastern section, it's way smaller. So it's nice sometimes to get a regional field guide because you have less birds to look through. So less things to potentially confuse you when you're looking for species. And also it's smaller if you want to carry it around with you when you're going outside. There's also reference guides, and those are not usually books that you're carrying out with you in your backpack because they're often quite large. So the Warbler Guide, for example, is really thick and heavy. These are books that you're going to leave at home probably, and they're getting really in-depth about certain families or groupings of birds if you're looking for more information. They're more like coffee table books for getting a lot of information. When you're looking for a field guide, it's really good to try out different field guides in your public library. Often they have a little bit of a selection so you can see what you like best and what features you like best. And in Newfoundland, there's also a partnership between Nature NL and the public libraries where there are bird watching backpacks in several of the locations. So if you're interested in trying out some binoculars and a field guide, and there's also some activity sheets and smaller little manuals inside, you can look and see if your local library has a birdwatching backpack, and that's a really cool way to try things out. Okay, I'm going to show you now sort of what the inside of the field guides look like. So this is the Sibley's Guide to Birds. It's one of the really popular ones that people use. And so, as I said, this is a painted guide. So you could see the pictures in it are paintings of males, females, and juveniles. And there will always be pictures or paintings of males, females, and juveniles. A field guide will always tell you the size of a bird, what it sounds like, the habitat that it uses. It will have these pictures, and it also always has a range map, which is down in the bottom left there. So just to give you an indication of what the National Geographic version looks like, it has all of those different categories, just it's in a different format. So all of the birds are on the right-hand side and all the information is on the left. So again, it's just a matter of preference, what you like best and what format you like best. Once you're looking through a field guide, you'll notice that they're all organized by families or groupings of birds. And so a family of birds is one that's genetically related to each other. And so they have similar characteristics, similar behaviors a lot of the time, and similar sort of looks. The characteristics will be described at the beginning of the family section. So for example, this is showing woodpeckers. It will tell you a little bit about woodpeckers at the top, show you all of the species that are found in that guide and what page they're on. So it's a nice way to sort of compare species as well. And I'll mention that the order of species can vary depending on your guide. And that's because they are ordered by genetic similarity or taxonomy. And so as more information comes in or people do research on certain species, they sometimes split them or move them. So the order might be different. The birds will still be in the guide, they just might be in a different spot. So that's just something to be aware of. I mentioned range maps. So range maps are a really important section of your field guide to pay attention to. A range map will tell you roughly where or when a bird is likely to be seen in an area. So for example, this is a range map of a white-throated sparrow. You can see the pinkish salmon color up at the top is the breeding range. And then it shows the other different seasons where it's expected to be as well. And these are really good, especially if you're looking at an unfamiliar bird out in the world and you have several different options in your field guide that look similar and you think could be right. Definitely take a look at the range map because some of them might not even be living in the area where you are. So you can eliminate certain species just by your geographic location. I'll also note that range maps can vary depending on new information as well as sometimes species will expand their range or contract their range. So they are moving around over the decades and years. And so sometimes it can be a little bit incorrect. So take the range maps with a grain of salt. But if you're like smack dab in the middle of the range, then you're definitely safe there, I would say. And just for an example, in Newfoundland, there's a species of owl called the northern saw-whet owl. And in the past, it has not been found in Newfoundland before. But just in the last 10 to 15 years, it's been showing up, and now it's a very common species. And so it's quite expected to be in Newfoundland. However, most of the range maps in field guides still don't have it living in Newfoundland at all. So that's just a note of caution, but range maps are generally really great to look at. So apart from paper guides, you can also get field guides that come as smartphone apps. And so these are really nice, of course, because they basically just fit in your pocket with your phone. And they also come with the added bonus of having sound files as well, usually. So you can have a little library of songs and calls for each species. So some of these are iBird Pro, Sibley Birds of North America, which is essentially the paper field guide only in electronic form. And that one is you do have to pay for. But then there's a couple of free ones like the Audubon Bird Guide and Merlin, which is by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it's really a popular one. You can also use it as an ID tool. But this is how it works as a field guide. Essentially, it has an Explore Birds button, which brings up all of the species in the area that you're living. So you can see here it has a whole bunch of the ducks up. And if you click on any of the species, it will come up with all of the same categories of information that you had in your paper field guide. So it'll have pictures of males and females and juveniles usually. It will tell you about the habitat. It will tell you about what they sound like and give sound files, and it will tell you a range map as well. So here's a few tips just as we get started or as you get started in identifying birds. The first one and most important one is that mistakes will happen. Mistakes even happen still for me, who has been identifying birds for 15 years now or so. They're always going to happen. You sometimes won't get all the information you need to make a positive ID, or the lighting will be bad, or who knows what. So don't beat yourself up if you can't figure out what a species is or if you get it wrong. Try not to get discouraged and just take it easy by starting with common birds that are living close to your house, ones that you see in the yard all the time. It's a good place to start just paying attention to all of the clues that we're going to be talking about in the next little while. Another point to note is that it's really tempting when you see a bird to get a quick glance at it and then quickly go to your field guide and look through to see what are the options of birds it could be. I'd recommend that you keep your eyes on the bird for as long as you can. So rather than taking just a quick look and going straight to your book or your phone, watch it, see what it's doing, see all of the colors and shapes within it that you can find, and get as many ID clues as you can before you go to your book to look it up. Sometimes you'll also be able only to identify a bird to a family or a grouping, just because, again, you might not get all of the clues you need. Sometimes different species look really similar, so you just can't tell, anything like that. And that's really okay. Like if you just see a duck and you know it's a duck and that's all, then that's pretty good still. And one other thing is learn the guide that you're using. So if you have a paper guide, just leave it out on your coffee table, flip through it when you're eating dinner. You'll just collect information just by looking at all of the different options in there, even if you aren't identifying a bird. So the next thing we'll get into here are the 4 keys that we use to identify birds. So this is shape, size, context, and coloration. And these are really the 4 things that we use to identify pretty well any object in our lives, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. So for example, I'll give an example of this little clementine or tangerine. If I look only at the shape of it, which is round, that could be anything. The size of it, it like fits in my palm, could be anything. The context is it's a food, it found in my fridge, it grows on a tree. Again, it could be a lot of different things. The color is bright orange. I mean, it could be less things, but still quite a few things. But if you put all of that information together, then you can be pretty sure that it's a little clementine. And so we use the same clues to figure out what a bird species is as well. So let's start with shape. Shape is really, really important for birds because often colors are similar, sizes are similar, but shape, you can get a lot of information out of shape. And sometimes you only see a silhouette of a bird, so shape can be really important for that as well. So when we're looking at the shape of a bird, we're looking at the shape of the bill, the legs, the neck, the body, and seeing how different or similar they are. So you can see these 3 birds here. They all have pretty long legs, for example, but they have very different lengths of necks. And the shape of their bill is very different from each other. So you know they're different species. And if you're trying to find or compare these silhouettes to those in your bird guide, looking at the shape of those different parts of their body will really help you out. This next slide here is from the Peterson Field Guide series, and it's just another way of seeing. These are all different, just silhouettes of different bird species, of just seeing how the shape of birds can help you narrow things down to a species. So we can see the huge variation in the shape of tails being sharp or small or square, the shape of the bills being tiny or long and pointed, and just taking note of the different shapes. You can also look at the shape of birds if they're flying overhead. This is especially helpful for raptors, and you can use clues of the wing and shape, the wing and tail shapes, depending on how pointed they are, how squared off they are, how rounded they are, that sort of thing. And that, especially for flying birds, can take a lot of time. It's really tricky, but it's something that is good to think of. When we're talking about shape still, we can look especially at the bill or beaks of birds, and that's because they vary very widely between different species and different families of birds. And that's because, of course, birds don't have hands. They're using their beaks as their main way of manipulating food. And so depending on what a bird is eating, it will have a different kind of bill. So for example, we have a long and straight bill up at the top, which is what a lot of shorebirds have because they're poking it into the ground to get little insects or crustaceans, that sort of thing, out of the mud. We have a wedge-shaped bill in the middle. That would be for like catching fish. We have a hooked bill, and that would be on all of the raptors, which are using it to like rip meat off of their prey. We can have short and conical bills, and those are really strong for crushing seeds or like taking the shells off of things. We could have short and pointed bills in the middle bottom, and they can use in like little tweezers for catching tiny insects. And then we have that typical duck bill, which is broad and flattened for straining edible matter out of water. So looking at the shape of a bill can be really helpful. The shape of a bird can change pretty drastically depending on their posture, how they're holding themselves, as well as how they're holding their feathers. So we have here a downy woodpecker, a robin, and a blue jay. And depending on how warm or cold they are, they'll look different. So for example, the woodpecker looks much different when he has his feathers all fluffed out. Same thing with the robin. The shape is very, very different. Now it's like a tennis ball because it's just staying poofy and warm. If you look at the blue jay there on the right, it's very alert. It has its crest up, but it can also put its crest down if it's relaxed. So just take note that sometimes birds, especially if you're taking pictures, can look a little bit different because you're catching them in a certain moment in time, of course. Okay, we'll move on to size. Size is a really important key, but it's mostly helpful when you're using it as a rough marker because size can be really tricky to tell when you're out in the field and you can't obviously like put up a ruler to measure your bird. So one of the important things you can do is look at relative proportions of birds. So this is when you compare the size of one of their features to other parts of themselves. So here we have, for example, a downy woodpecker and a hairy woodpecker, which, as you can see, look very, very similar. If you look in the field guide, you'll see that hairy woodpecker is much bigger than a downy woodpecker. But if you don't really have them side by side, you can't tell that very easily. So what's the best way to tell them apart? The downy woodpecker on the top, which is A in the bottom corner there, its bill is really tiny in comparison to its own head. So if you flipped its bill back onto its head, it only goes up less than half of the length of the head, so just to the back of the eye. But the hairy woodpecker, if you look at its bill in comparison to the size of its head, which is B down at the bottom, if you flip it back on its head, it goes more than half the length of the head, way past the back of the eye. And so that's a really, really good way to tell those two species apart, but also just shows you how you can use the bird itself to compare other pieces of itself. That didn't make any sense. Sorry. So size is also useful, not necessarily for the, 6.7 inches that the field guide is telling you, but so that you can compare the size of a bird you see to the size of a bird you already know. So for example, you could say it's bigger than a robin. It was smaller than a crow. It was about the size of a sparrow. So you can use birds you're familiar with and use them as size markers. You can also use objects that you're familiar with, like a bird feeder in your yard, or other familiar objects to compare birds to that so that you can get a relative size. And here again is a downy woodpecker and a hairy woodpecker beside each other. So you could see like the huge size difference, but on their own, you wouldn't be able to tell. Let's move on now to our third key, which is context. And context is basically what the bird is doing, where it is, the time of year, its behavior, anything that's not how it looks, pretty much. So really, you're gleaning any kind of information you can about what the bird is doing, where it is, as in, is it on bare ground? Is it in open land? Is it in a shrub? Is it crawling up a tree trunk? Is it on or in water? How is it feeding? Is it summer or is it winter? All this sorts of things. And so I'll go into habitat a little bit right now. I'll just give that one. And so bird species are sort of on a spectrum between a generalist for habitat or a specialist for habitat. And so on the right there, we have an American robin. And American robins are really a generalist species. They can use pretty well any habitat in Newfoundland, and you'll find a robin breeding there, from like in the city out to the middle of the forest that no one ever goes to. On the other hand, here on the specialist side of things, we have a red-winged blackbird there. And a red-winged blackbird is a habitat specialist. And that's because it needs to have a certain kind of wetland in order to breed successfully. So let's say we have a wetland that we have red-winged blackbirds in, but then that's like turned into part of the town and they fill the wetland. That red-winged blackbird won't be able to adapt to living in the town. But if the same thing happened to a robin, it would still be able to live there. So that's how you can sort of tell what's a specialist versus a generalist. And so as you get more familiar with birds and as you read through your field guide and the species, you'll be able to tell when you're in a habitat what birds you are expecting. So I'll just go through, I think maybe 5 or 6 general habitat types that are in Newfoundland, and I'll give you sort of rapid fire a few different species that are living that you can expect to find in there. And you don't need to remember all these right now, but just to give you a bit of a taste of how you might expect to remember later. So of course, we have urban habitats. Basically, this just means there's a high density of people living there. Obviously, there's less vegetation, less natural areas for birds to live in, but birds that are living in urban areas can really capitalize on the human presence, and they can still survive in areas like this. And so some birds that you're expecting are things like the European starling, a house sparrow. Both of those are introduced from Europe, and so and they are rampant in North America. They're really good at surviving here. And they'll go into little gaps behind your siding or into little holes like here on the electrical poles, and they'll nest in there really successfully. You can also find things like rock doves or pigeons and American robins, as I mentioned earlier. Another habitat type in Newfoundland is coastal habitat. And this is where we have some of our most iconic species. This is where you'll find seabirds and shorebirds, gulls and terns, things like bald eagles and osprey. And these are areas where birds are both using the sea and the land. So we have things like northern gannets. We have things like common murre, black-legged kittiwake, and bald eagles. We also have barrens or tundra, and these are areas that are often void of a lot of vegetation. They're pretty rocky usually. They don't have much other than grass or maybe sort of small shrubs. And so it's quite open land, usually windswept, and quite harsh. And things that we can expect are certain species of sparrows, some pipits and larks like this horned lark. We can expect, here's a savanna sparrow and northern harrier. We can expect short-eared owls and rock ptarmigan as well. We also have wetlands in Newfoundland. Newfoundland is part of the boreal forest, which holds most of the world's wetlands. And there's several different kinds of wetlands, which we're not going to get really into, but we have marshes, bogs, swamps, and open water. And so you can expect birds that are using the vegetation that's associated with both water and land, so small standing water and land. And these are things like ducks and shorebirds, certain kinds of warblers, certain kinds of sparrows, blackbirds, and swallows. And so here's a few examples: the red-winged blackbird, the common yellowthroat, the greater yellowlegs, the Lincoln sparrow, and the ring-necked duck, among many, many others. We also, of course, have coniferous forests all over the island. These are the trees that don't lose their leaves in the winter, the evergreens. And they can vary quite a lot in how they look based on how old they are and what kind of trees they are. So there's a lot of different species that will use coniferous forest, of course, and some specific ones are the blackpoll warbler, the white-throated sparrow, the white-winged crossbill, and the hermit thrush, along with many others. We also have, of course, deciduous and mixed forest. So deciduous forests are the trees that lose their leaves in the winter. So we can have purely deciduous forest, or we can have deciduous mixed with coniferous. And again, we have so many options of families and species that live in these areas, but often there's a really high diversity of species because of the mix of different kinds of trees in these areas. So we can have things like blue-headed vireo, ruffed grouse, and warblers like the American redstart. And this is the last habitat that I'll go through, which probably won't be written like this in a field guide, but I've called it deciduous shrubs. And these in Newfoundland are essentially when the alders are growing back along the side of the trailway, for example, or any of the woods roads. Those really quick growing shrubby plants that are like an octopus if you're trying to crawl through them. Deciduous shrubs or alders are also home to many smaller birds that are usually skulking around and really hard to find, but they are often quite bright and beautiful. And these are things like yellow warbler, mourning warbler, and Wilson's warbler, along with many others, of course, again. And so that was just like a really quick overview of what some of the habitats are. And again, that's a context clue when you're looking for identifying a species. And as we go through the next weeks coming through, hopefully you'll join us for some more of the sessions, and we'll go through each of these species one by one to show how to identify each one of them. Okay, we'll go back to some more context clues. So birds also fly in different flight patterns depending on what species they are. So not all birds just start at point A and fly straight to point B. We also have birds that do flap, flap, glide, and these are things like accipiters, which are small hawks. Things like grouse do that. We also have birds that soar on thermals, so heat rises, of course, and as the heat rises, they can go up on these thermals in big circles. Those are large hawks and gulls. And we also have certain bird species who do an undulating flight. So they're like bopping up and down as they fly. And those are the things like the finches and the woodpeckers. So if you see or pay attention to how a bird is flying from point to point, you can also often break it down into a family or some sort of grouping. We can also get context from feeding behavior. Sorry. And so this is especially helpful. So I'm choking on my water. This is especially helpful for ducks because they come in two different groupings. We have dabbling ducks as well as diving ducks. And those are in different sections of your field guide as well, so they split up. And they do what their names say for feeding behavior. So even if you only get a look at a duck on a lake and the lighting is really bad, and you can only tell if one is dabbling, so that's like the picture on the left where they stick their tail up in the air and they're just like poking around under the water. You can narrow it down to only a certain subset of ducks. On the other hand, if it's diving underwater and like popping up again, but fully submerging itself, then it's a diving duck. And so you can go to a different section and get a smaller subset of ducks. So watching for the feeding behavior can also be really helpful in narrowing your options down. The last key that we'll go through is coloration. And I left this one for last because the others are incredibly important. If the only thing that you focus on is the color of a bird, you can definitely get led astray. And so, for example, we have here two different birds that are colored very differently, but they're actually the same species. This is the male on the left and the female on the right of a pine grosbeak. So when you're looking at the colors and patterns of a bird, first look overall at what colors it is, the main colors, and then you can break it down into sections of the birds that are most important to pay attention to for color. So the first one is the face. There's a few different patterns that you can expect to find in the face of a bird. So one is a line that goes through the eye. It'll be referred to as an eye line. Sometimes it's only in front of the eye, sometimes it's only behind the eye, and sometimes it's all the way through. And sometimes it's absent. You can also have lines above the eye, which are called the supercilium or the eyebrow. You could also have a circle around the eye, like the bottom right there, which will be called an eye ring. And that can be either fully surrounding the eye, it can be only partially around the eye, it can be really bold, or it can be faint. And those will be species specific. You can also have a face with no markings at all, which in itself is a clue, or you can have other bold patterns like in the top right. Another important place to look for colors and patterns is the belly and breast of a bird. This is really helpful, especially for sparrows, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So you're looking for things like streaks or spots, paying attention to the location of those, how high up or low down on the bird it is. You're looking for rings around the neck. You're looking for fully plain belly or breast with no markings. You can look for a bib, like in the mourning warbler in the bottom middle there. Or you can look for a breast band, which is what it's called with that red-tailed hawk on the bottom right, where it's just a one band of spotting across the breast. Another important place to look for colors and patterns is the wings. So there's a few options of what you'll look for on the wings. One is no markings at all, like the crow on the bottom is just fully plain. That's a clue in itself. You can also look for wing bars, which is up on the top right there. Some birds have 2 bars of very pale colored feathers on the wings, which are called wing bars. And also, especially for ducks, you can look on the wing when they're flying or stretching, that they'll have a colorful section called the supercilium. And those are really good for identifying duck species and paying attention to those wing patterns for other species. I'll make a note here that Males and females, for some species, look different. So this is called sexual dimorphism. Males are often more brightly and boldly colored, while females are often duller, grayer, browner, more drab. And that's because the females are hiding on the nest and they want to be inconspicuous, while the males are trying to attract a female or take care of their territory, that sort of thing. So for example, on the left here, we have a mallard. The male is on the top, brightly colored. The female is on the bottom, and she's brown. The same thing with the house sparrow on the right. The male is on the top. He's much more boldly colored, and the female is on the bottom. This is the case for some species, but not all species. I'll also note that the colors can change through the seasons. So again, we have the mallard here on the right, and ducks have a special plumage change in the summer. The male ducks go through what's called eclipse plumage when they take on the feather coloration of a female. So you can see on the bottom picture, there's a female in the back, and the one in the front is a male. Same thing with a lot of other bird species. In the summer, they'll be very brightly colored, but in the winter, they'll have duller feathers and duller coloration, like the goldfinch on the left. Okay, so just to go back to our 4 here, we have shape, size, context, and coloration, and you'll use as many clues from all of those 4 keys to get as much information about a bird, and then you look at your field guide to see what you can find. So I'll just go back to the Merlin app again and show you how they also use these same categories in their bird ID section. So they have a section where you can start bird ID and you can put in information about a bird you see. So let's say, for example, we saw this picture of this bird and we want to know what it is. We saw it out in our yard. It'll ask where you saw the bird. So that's a context question. It'll ask when, again, a context question. It asks what size it was compared to birds that you're likely to know. So for this case, we're saying it's sparrow-sized or smaller. And then it asks what colors. It asks more context about what the bird was doing. In this case, we're saying in trees or bushes. And then it creates a list of possible birds. And this is really nice for people who are getting started and really want to get familiar with the birds that are around them. So in this case, it was correct. The first answer that it gave was an American goldfinch, but it gave all these other species that look kind of similar and are the same kind of size range. So if you're using this tool, you can use this as sort of a starting point of investigating all the species that look really similar, so you can get a good idea of what you have around you. So as I mentioned before, your field guides are organized by families. And so we're going to go through, for this last section of tonight, not all, but most of the different families of birds that you can find breeding in Newfoundland. So I'll talk about the characteristics that they have and point out different clues to help you sort of get down into a family level so you can have somewhere to start in your field guide. So we are focusing on birds in the summertime, and most of the pictures are birds of males, or sorry, most of the pictures are of male birds because they are a little bit easier to tell apart because they are more brightly colored. And so we'll start with ducks. And as I mentioned before, ducks are split into 2 sections, the dabblers and the divers. These ones here are dabbling ducks. So they're the ones that are tipping their tails up in the air. They're feeding just at the surface of the water. And they're really great to start learning at this time of year, actually, because ducks are easier to find in the winter closer to the shoreline. So they're easier to see up close. And also they go in like larger congregations this time of year. And they're typically paired off. So males and females will be together. Dabbling ducks are quite comfortable walking on land. Their legs are situated that they can walk comfortably around. So any duck that you see walking around on land really easily is a dabbling duck. And As you can see, they all have this sort of broad duck-shaped bill. People are usually familiar with what is a duck and what's not. Dabbling ducks can also take off from land, and they can also take off directly from water. They don't need to have any running start or anything like that. So that's in comparison to the diving ducks, which we have here. And the diving ducks are much more comfortable underwater. They're diving for their food. So they are going down to the bottom, they're catching fish, they're eating crustaceans down at the bottom, potentially, or plants, and they're popping up in different locations. Their legs are farther back on their body, so they're not as comfortable walking on land because they have a bit of a balance issue. So they're not often seen on land. And they also have smaller size wings for their body size. So it takes them a little bit more effort to get flying. So you'll probably see the diving ducks sort of running on top of the water a little bit before they take off rather than springing right up into the air. These are female ducks of the species that were on those last two pages. And as you can see, they are quite similar looking, and female ducks are really difficult to tell apart because they're mostly this brown mottled coloration. However, this time of year especially is really good because, as I said, you'll have them often in pairs with males. So you can compare you can see that the shape of the bird, the shape of the head, the shape of the bill, the size of the body is the same as the male. So you can start picking out ducks by shape. And if you're trying to identify female ducks, definitely pay attention to the pattern in the head and the colors in the head, even like minute details, as well as those scapular colorations, that section of the wing that has color, because the female ducks will have the same bright patch as the males typically. Okay, our next family that we'll talk about is grouse and allies. And so these are our grouse and ptarmigan, and they're all like chicken-like ground-dwelling birds. They're pretty unmistakable, this family. They're walking around on the ground. They are springing out and giving you a heart attack when you come upon one and startle one because it startles you back. So it's pretty easy to figure out when you need to look for grouse or allies in your field guide. We also have loons. There's only one species of loon that breeds in Newfoundland. It's the common loon. Superficially, they look like a duck. They are associated with water, of course, and they are expert divers. So their legs are set super far back on their body, which makes them really powerful swimmers, but it also makes them incredibly awkward on land. You will likely never see a loon walking on land unless you're seeing it go to or from its nest. They're really cute because they carry their young on their backs for a certain section of time before the young is old enough to thermoregulate for themselves. And if you're comparing them to a duck, you'll see, just take a look at the bill, and you'll see that the loon has a really sharp pointed bill as opposed to that broad duck bill. And they also have a different looking tail section. So they have a really fluffy looking tail, whereas the ducks have more of a longer, sharper tail. Oh, sorry. And I also want to say that loons, because they are also have such a heavy body size, they take a really long time to get into the air as well. So they need a huge runway to run on top of the water before they'll take flight. We also, of course, have seabirds here, which I mentioned a little bit of. Seabirds is not a category that you'll find written the title of in your field guide, but all the species will be near the beginning and grouped together. These are all species that are found in large colonies. They actually spend all year out on the ocean, other than during the breeding season when they come back to these huge congregations along the cliffs and shorelines where they can't be attacked by predators. And they're birds that are flying really long distances to hunt for fish to bring back to their chicks. And so they're also amazing divers. We also have diurnal raptors. Diurnal is a word that means daytime. And so these are the birds of prey that are active during the day. This is hawks, eagles, and falcons. And sometimes, depending on your field guide, falcons will not be included in the diurnal raptors section, but it will be right nearby. So these are the birds of prey, as I said. They all have, if you look at their bill, they have that sharp pointed bill because they're using it for eating their prey. They have really strong talons. They do range in size from the huge bald eagle down to the American kestrel, which is around the size of a robin. And so that's really interesting to note. But they do all have the same sort of hunting tactics where they're hunting other birds or animals from the air or a perch, and they're eating meat. Our next family is the shorebirds. Shorebirds are actually quite variable, and they're most often associated with the edge of water, but sometimes things like killdeer, for example, are somewhat farther away from wetlands or in drier areas. Shorebirds are typically walking around on the ground, and so they have these long, prominent legs. They do have a lot of variety in bill shape and size, but you can take a look at how they're feeding and use that as an identification tool as well, because they can either poke in the ground, they're probing, or they'll pick at things, or they're swishing their bill in the water to stir things up. And these are the species here that breed in Newfoundland, but there's actually a lot more that migrate through during migration season, which is late summer to early fall. But we have far less in the true summer or early summer months. Our next family is gulls and terns, and a lot of people are familiar with these two. They're, of course, large white birds, sometimes with black on them. They're hard to tell, to identify to species at a distance usually, because they can look quite similar to each other. And often people call these seagulls for the gulls, and there are different species of gulls in Newfoundland, including the herring gull, ring-billed gull, and the great black-backed gull. The great black-backed gull is truly gigantic, and it's actually the largest gull in the world, which is really cool. We also have terns, of course, and terns are sort of the sleeker cousins of the gulls. They have long, narrow wings and tails and a very pointy, sharp bill. Both the gulls and terns do hunt for fish and are associated with water, but gulls often will go farther inland and range farther away from the ocean. Terns are way more agile and I guess fancy with their flying, and so they look. You can usually tell the difference between a gull and a tern in the air by the shape of the wings and their flying style. Our next family is the owls. A lot of people, again, are quite familiar with owls, and that's because they have these really distinctive facial discs, and those are used to funnel sound into their ears, which are offset on their head so that they can detect the precise location of their prey, since they're typically hunting by sound alone. And so the ears are not actually like the tufts of what you see on the top of the great horned owl there. Those big tufts are actually just feathers. The ears are internal in the head as well, similar to ours, sort of, except for without the flap. I'm actually missing one species of owl here, the boreal owl. But most owls are active during the nighttime, of course, but the short-eared owl here and the northern hawk owl are also active during the day. Our next family is the woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are pretty familiar. Most people can say be pretty sure that they saw a woodpecker, even if you can't tell what species it is. So they have an upright posture. They're typically on the side of a tree trunk, holding themselves up with their stiff tail feathers, and they drum away at the tree trunks. They're looking for insects underneath the bark. We also have the northern flicker, which is on the bottom picture there. That's also a woodpecker. They're way more colorful and tropical looking than our other woodpeckers, so they can often be a little bit confusing. And they also will sit on the ground because they really like ants a lot. But those are also a woodpecker, and they have the similar shape to those other ones that you would expect on the trees. Woodpeckers, when you're seeing them flying, they do have that undulating flight, so they're dipping up and down as they fly by. And males and females look a little bit different because these are all the males, and females will just lose that patch of color and otherwise look the same. Our next family is the flycatchers. Flycatchers are a little bit smaller. They're between a sparrow and a robin size. And flycatchers, like their name indicates, catch flies and aerial insects. They'll sit on a perch in a very upright posture, and they'll fly out, catch an insect, fly back to the perch, and eat it there. So that's a very typical behavior for flycatchers. They are quite similar looking to each other, and so often it's easier to identify them by song or call than by looking at them, just because they're so similar. And males and females of these species look the same. We also have corvids, which is our next family, and it includes crows and jays. These ones are also quite familiar to people because they're quite large birds and conspicuous, and they're often very loud and vocal. So a lot of people know Canada jays. They used to be called gray jays, or you might know them as whiskey jacks. And all of these birds here, the corvids, are very highly intelligent. They're pretty crafty. You probably have had your camp snacks stolen by a Canada jay at some point. And so a lot of people are familiar with these birds, and they can be very comfortable with humans. I'll just take a second to dive into crows and ravens for one slide here, because they do look so similar that I think it's nice to show how they're different, so people can tell them apart. So ravens are quite a bit larger than crows, but again, if you don't have them side by side, that's pretty hard to tell. But if you have them flying, if you take a look at those silhouettes there, you'll see that the tail of the crow is curved in a C for crow. If you look at the tail of the raven, it's in a diamond shape. So those two shapes, if it's flying overhead, are very distinctive, and you could tell apart a crow and a raven like that. If you have them perched and close enough to see clearly, you'll see that the crow on the left there, its throat feathers are very smooth and small, whereas the raven's throat feathers are really long and shaggy. As well, the bill of the raven is larger than the head, and the crow's bill is quite a bit smaller than its head. So that's how you could tell those two species apart. Now you can impress your friends and family. The next family that we'll go through is swallows. We do have a few species of swallows here. These are under the category of aerial insectivores, and that just means that they catch insects while they're flying. They all have long, narrow, pointed wings, and that allows them to do aerial acrobatics, which are necessary to catch those insects while they're flying around. And these are all very small birds, like almost the size of a chickadee, just with longer wings and tail. There's quite a bit of variation between the species here in their habitat and where you'll find them, because you can vary from nesting in nest boxes close to humans, or you can have them far away from human habitation, and those are all under the swallow category. They almost look like bats when they're flying because of how rapidly they beat their pointed wings. We'll move on now to chickadees and nuthatches. These species are also pretty familiar to people, especially if you have bird feeders out. They stick around all winter, which is nice for this time of year, so you can go out and hang out with them in the woods. Chickadees and boreal chickadees and black-capped chickadees are both very pretty curious about humans often. They would fit in the palm of your hand. They're quite small, and they are eating little tiny seeds and insects from the branches of trees. The nuthatch there on the bottom, red-breasted nuthatch, is the only nuthatch that we have in Newfoundland. And they're really interesting, and you could tell them easily apart from other species because they always point their face downward when they're feeding. So most birds point their face upward as they're moving around the world. The nuthatch will point its face downward on the tree trunk. And again, these are species that the males and females look the same. We also have the family called thrushes, and this includes robins and other species of thrush, which we have here on the page. But probably most people know the American robin, and that's the quintessential thrush physique. So they have long legs. All of these species are hopping around on the ground usually and digging around for insects that are hiding in the leaves and other ground cover. And they're often hard to see because, well, other than the robin, they're often hard to see because they're skulking around in the underbrush in sort of these thicker forests. All of the thrushes have really beautiful songs because they can actually harmonize with themselves. So if you listen to any of those, you could probably end up picking them out, at least that you've heard a thrush singing. And they have a very alert posture. They have a deep chest, and they have that sturdy sort of all-purpose bill. Our next family is the warblers. And sometimes people call them the jewels of the birding world because look how bright and beautiful they are. These are the males, so the females are typically duller, as I mentioned earlier, but the males are a good place to start when you're learning the warblers. They are very small birds, sort of like a chickadee size, and they're very active. So they're always bopping around in the bushes. They're often hidden by leaves because they're so small, and so they can be hard to spot because of that. Thankfully, the trees in Newfoundland aren't too tall, so they are not like way up in the sky, giving you warbler neck, which is what people call staring up at the top of the trees for warblers. And if you look at their bill specifically, you can tell that it's a warbler because they have that really thin tweezer-like bill, and they're using that to pick off little insects from the branches and behind leaves. So I know that's a lot of warblers there. So I'm just going to pull out 3 here that are some of the most common that are around in Newfoundland, and also ones that can be found nearer to human habitation in higher numbers. So this is the yellow warbler, black and white warbler, and yellow rumped warbler. And so if you're trying to figure out your warblers or start watching them as spring comes through, try and focus maybe on just a few that are around your area so that you don't get quite overwhelmed at the beginning. Just try and pick out maybe these 3 and move on from there. We'll move on now to sparrows and juncos. These are a pretty difficult group to identify to species, especially when you're beginning, because for a couple of reasons. One, they are pretty small and sneaky, and they really like to hide, and they're really good at it. And the second is because they're often just brown and streaky, and so it's really hard to pull out the differences. These birds are often hopping around on the ground or in low-lying trees and shrubs. They'll fly directly from one spot to another very quickly. And the males and females look mostly the same. A good place to look for them is at the breast and belly to split them apart based on the streaking and the patterns there. And if you look at the bills of these birds, you can know that they're sparrows because they have that broad triangular bill, and they're using that to crack open little seeds and nuts. Our next group is the blackbirds. Blackbirds are, well, mostly black colored, which is nice to know their family name. And so these are bold colored birds. They're all very large, larger than a robin. And they all have these sharp conical bills. that you can see similarly between those three species. Um, they're often associated with water, so they're not actually living in the water, but they'll be near the edge of the water, or interacting with the water in some way for foraging and that sort of thing. And they're often quite conspicuous and loud, so they're easy to spot. This is our last major group that I'll talk about tonight. This is the finches and grosbeaks. The finches and grosbeaks are also really nice to start learning this time of year because they'll stick around for the winter, and they will also often come to bird feeders. So if you have a feeder up, you might have seen some of these before. As you can see, these are the males. They're quite bright and colorful. They'll come to cities and towns, and often in the wild, they're found up higher in trees rather than hopping around on the ground. Males and females do look different, so the females are typically browner or more dull colored than the males here. And these are another species that is cracking open seeds, and so they have sort of these strong conical bills that they are using for crunching open those seeds. The finches and grosbeaks also have an undulating flight. So again, that's the flight where they dip up and down as they go along. So that can help you, if you see them flying that way, start bringing you down to the finches and grosbeaks family. Okay, our final bird that we're looking at tonight is the house sparrow. So this is also a sparrow, but it's actually not really related to the other sparrows I had earlier. This is a European species of sparrow, so it's not related, and it's often at the very end of your field guide, which is maybe why you haven't been able to find it in one before. They're very associated with urban areas. They're not really found outside of human habitation, and they're pretty much everywhere in Newfoundland where there's houses. Again, the males and females look different. So the males on the left there and the females on the right. And these are ones that you can probably learn pretty easily just by watching out your window at some point this winter even, because they'll be still around too. Okay, I'll just talk to you now about a few different resources that you can use to start practicing your birds if you want to, while a lot of them are away for the winter down south. And so the first one is eBird quizzes. I'll send links to these as well in the resources I send later on this week to you all. And so this is eBird is another citizen science portal where you can put all of your bird sightings into, and it's worldwide. It's really cool to look at what everybody has seen everywhere. But they have this free online quizzing tool where you can put in the location that you are and the time of year, and it will come up with a little photo quiz, or you can also do a song quiz, but probably a photo quiz is best to start. And so these are just ones you can go through on your own. It will give you options on the side, and you can choose which one you like. So this is nice. Also, same thing, similar to the Merlin app that I showed you earlier, that you can compare these similar species that they're giving us options and sort of learn that way. I'll mention that Nature Newfoundland and Labrador is also having some bird learning nights events. And so they essentially go through the eBird quizzes online together, and anybody's free to go to that. It's a free event. And so you can find out details about that on their Facebook page. They have an event posting there. So the next one seems to be February 13th. Another online resource you can use is called Dendroica, and it's again a repository of photos and song files, and you can make a free account and make custom quizzes or lists, and you can use that to practice or test yourself, or just take a look at all the different options of birds that are out there. So it's pretty cool. And the last one that I'll mention is the Birds Canada Photo Identification Guide. And so this is a similar thing. You can put in your location and a time of year, and it will give you a printout of pictures of the most common birds that you're likely to see in your area. So that's pretty nice if you want to have like an event with your family, or you just want to make a list of, check off a list of birds in your area or your yard. that can be a great starting point just to have a visual, a quick little visual tool of what the species are that you'll see in your area. And that actually concludes all of the information I'll tell you for this evening. So thank you everybody for coming. And I hope that that's helped you sort of get start on what to look for when you're trying to identify birds and how to use some different tools. Everyone starts as a beginner, so be patient with yourself and just enjoy our fun feathery friends. If you want to get involved with either the Atlas or the Owl survey, feel free to get in touch with us. You can follow us on social media, and we are always happy to take donations if you feel so inclined, since we just run off of grants and that sort of thing. And so I don't know what's happened in the chat, but maybe I'll get the others to pop in and let me know if there's been any questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has by unmuting themselves as well.
Thanks, Jenna. Great job as always. I am mostly seeing thanks in the chat right now. We did have a question earlier about places to buy binoculars in St. John's, but I think we got that one answered. Yeah, so everybody's just saying thank you. Everybody knows what they're doing. You gave such a great intro.
Oh, wonderful.
People are ready to go.
That's perfect. And where can you find binoculars in St. John's, just for people who weren't reading the chat?
Well, if you're in St. John's, there are a number of places I'd look. The Outfitters downtown has some small, relatively inexpensive ones. Canadian Tire might also have them. The Coastal Outdoors place down on Water Street should have some. And you can also check Newfoundland Camera and Imaging, which has some slightly higher end pairs.
Good to know.
And there was a recommendation in the chat for Vortex binoculars, which I know you would second, Jenna.
Yes, I do have Vortex Diamondback, and I love them very much.
Oh, and somebody says Outdoor Pros. So yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, often outdoor stores will have them, but also camera stores. What bird seed feeders would we recommend in NL? I have moved here from Ontario, and the feeders that worked there don't seem popular here. I don't think it is the feeders and the seed that are not popular, but if you go around and you have a look at our coniferous trees this year, you'll see that there are crazy numbers of cones, particularly on the white spruce. And so what's probably happening is the birds have plenty of food to eat in the natural world, and they're not coming to feeders as much. And you're not the only person that's noticed that. I was chatting with Jared Clark, who's one of our local birders here on Sunday, and he made the same observation. I haven't even tried to fill my feeder yet, but I haven't seen anybody checking it out. So it's likely not the issue of the seed that you've got out or the type of feeder you have so much as it's just, this is not going to be a great year for feeders.
Very interesting, yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. Oh, yes, Manny says binoculars can also be purchased from urban nature stores and Peely Wings Nature Store. Peely Wings is a great place to go if you want to get really high-end binoculars. Very expensive binoculars. Lovely, lovely place to get binoculars. That's where mine came from, as a special treat to myself. It's nice, though. Certainly, you can order things like binoculars online. I myself like to try them out in person to see if they work well for my eyes, and particularly the space between my eyes. So some people, particularly those with smaller faces, may find binoculars, the lenses won't go close enough together for them. So I would recommend, yeah, buying in person, local, and trying out a few pairs to see what you like.
Mm-hmm.
All right, it looks like that is everybody. Yeah, it looks like there are no more questions. So thank you again, Jenna, for a great presentation. And we hope to see some of you back again next week for our presentation on seabirds, which is, of course, a Newfoundland specialty. So it's a fun one to do.
Sounds great. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll hopefully see you next week.